Hello and welcome to the Learn from the Top 10 webinar. Thank you all for making the time to hear about our research and some of the latest trends in contact centre sales behaviours. We really appreciate that there's actually over 50 people who've taken the time out of what I'm sure are your hectic schedules to attend and have a listen to what we found through our research. We've deliberately kept the webinar short and sharp, so let's just jump straight into it. Firstly, my name is Peter Grist. At Grist, we're all about helping organisations align the behaviour of their frontline with the business's value proposition and objectives. We do this by providing benchmarking, which we'll be discussing today, but also we design and develop change programs that help organisations make changes, sometimes that are highlighted through the benchmarking that we do. We primarily do this in sales and service organisations, and we've now been doing this for over 25 years. So just as a brief rundown on what we're going to be looking at today, firstly, I'll just take you very quickly through the methodology by which we generate the insights. Secondly, we'll have a look at the difference in performance of the top 10 compared to other contact centres that we've benchmarked. Following this, we'll do a deep dive into some of the very specific sales behaviours that are driving a better customer experience for those top 10 organisations. And then we will also take you through some of the critical sales behaviours in the form of a customer journey slide that really highlights the difference in approach taken by the better performing companies. And finally, we'll have a look at some of the things that you might be able to do immediately to see how you compare with the organisations that are doing well, or if you're one of the organisations that's doing well, how you might compare with some of your peers. As we go through the webinar, please ask as many questions as you can, and we'll get through as many of those questions as we can throughout the time. You'll see on the right-hand side of your screen, there's an area there for you to ask questions, so please just click on that and write some free text in there. We will then monitor those questions as we go through the presentation or the webinar, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we possibly can. Okay, so let's click through to the next slide, and we'll start with how we come up with the data. As I often say to people, it's critical that you understand and are convinced of the validity and reliability of the method with which we gather the data. Otherwise, then you're really not going to accept the insights that follow. So the data is based on our inbound sales effectiveness benchmark, which is generated from calls that we make to a variety of sales and service organisations across many industries. We employ what we call customer surrogates to make the call that are based on a prospect looking to purchase a product. Our analysts, who are separate from the customer surrogates, then assess the quality of the sales interaction by comparing it to our benchmark, which contains over 50 best practice needs-based selling behaviours that we've come up with those through our 25 years of experience. While the scenario changes from industry to industry, the benchmark does not, and that's because it's based on needs-based selling, and that allows us to compare performance within and across industries. The basis of the benchmark are behavioural criteria that are marked as a yes or no, which are then weighted to come up with the category and overall scores. The weightings for each behavioural criteria are based on the correlations between those behaviours and KPIs such as conversion and advocacy. So as an example, broad questioning, which is one of our criteria where we're trying to understand the true customer need, is one of the most highly weighted criteria in the whole benchmark because we know that that has a greater correlation through to sales conversion. The ultimate aim is to ensure that an improvement in benchmark performance, in overall benchmark performance, correlates with the KPIs that you're really looking for, which is generally around happier customers, more sales, and happy staff. So let's have a look at, jump in and have a look at some of the data that we came up with. So as I think most of you will have already seen, here's the top 10 based on a company's ability to engage with and acquire customers. So firstly, a big congratulations to all of those companies that made it into the top 10. And once again, congratulations to the health insurance industry that makes up 6 of the top 10 positions. So I often get asked about the health insurance industry and why it performs so well, and I don't necessarily profess to have all of the answers, but just some of the, I guess, a couple of ideas that I think really are unique to the health insurance industry and help them drive them to create a better customer experience. Firstly is the complexity of the product that needs to be tailored to the individual situation. So there's lots of extras and lots of different types of covers for health insurance, and in order to help the customer really understand the best solution, then we really do need to ask them some questions. I also think that it's a product that is probably more easy to relate to when you're an agent. So as we know, a lot of the agents that are in contact centres are young, and many of them don't have a lot of life experience, say, with things like mortgages and life insurance. However, pretty much everyone knows something about health and has had something to do with the health system, whether it's their own or their family. So I think that also makes it a little easier for contact centre agents to engage with their customers around the product. And then the other thing I'd say is actually it's industry leadership. The leading companies in the industry are driving a race to the top based on a great customer experience, whereas there are some other industries that are still in a race to the bottom based on price. But this is an especially good performance by health insurance, given that the aggregators are playing a large role in this industry, and it's continuing to lift its performance in the benchmark. And this does go against some of the experience in overseas in other industries, where the introduction of aggregators into a market has increased commoditisation and focus on price. So we are really seeing the health insurance industry to some degree buck the trend there. This slide, just the next slide that we're going to be looking at now, highlights some of the changes from last year. So we've got the top 10 there for 2014 and the top 10 for 2015. What I would say at this point is that it is very close at the top. There's only a small percentage difference in the performance of the top performing companies. So in effect, all of the companies in the top 2, 3 or 4 can be very proud of the sales experience that they're delivering for their customers and the work they've done behind the scenes leading and developing people. Trust me, we know how hard it is to get a large group of people to consistently deliver a customer-focused value proposition. So a big congratulations to those companies that are in the top 10 and at the top of the tree. What I would like to also say is congratulations to the Help Me Choose Health Insurance, iSelect Motor Insurance, NAB Mortgages and Australian Unity for being part of the top 10 for the first time. A key call out though is particularly for iSelect Motor Insurance and Energy teams. Traditionally, these industries have been some of the worst performing industries in the benchmark and characterised by a disengaged, reactive, process-driven customer experience. For iSelect to be able to create a much more engaging, proactive and customer-focused experience while selling these products is a credit to them and an indication of how new market entrants can really shake up the incumbents in particular industries. Okay, let's now have a look at what the top 10 are doing that sets them apart. In this section, we've just concentrated on the areas that provide the most insight and where the difference between the top 10 and the rest is the greatest. So you see on this slide, the average score for the top 10 in our benchmark is 67%. So there's still opportunities to improve for the top 10 compared to an average score for the bottom 10 of 38%. That's a 29% difference in performance, but what that really means from a customer experience point of view is that if you contact one of the top performers, you are much more likely to get an agent who provides some structure at the start of the call and then lets you know that you're dealing with an expert who will work to understand your needs, recommend a tailored solution. Whereas if you call one of the bottom performers, you will feel like you are being processed and may or may not be even get a recommendation or some guidance about the product that suits you. The other major difference is the level of engagement. agents in the top performing contact centres want to, agents in the bottom performing contact centres want to process you as quickly as possible, and the less you, the customer, babble on about your situation and needs, the better. And that's how the conversation feels in those bottom performing centres. The two comparisons we've got on this slide show the performance in the two major categories that make up the benchmark, which are engagement and acquisition. Engagement being about how customer focused you are, and acquisition being whether you can actually demonstrate the core sales skills. And they reinforce what we were discussing on the previous slide. The engagement category is a measure of, as I said, how customer focused you are, and then the acquisition is really about the sales skills. These category scores are based on a subset of behaviours that naturally fall into one category or the other. These category scores are weighted averages of the behavioural criteria scores, as I mentioned before. The graphs compare the average performance of the top 10 against the average of all the other companies, and also the average of the bottom 10 companies that we assessed in the benchmark. So as you'll see there, the engagement scores from the top 10 to all the others drops by about 7%, and then there's a further 7% drop back to the bottom performers, which is overall a 14% difference in the engagement score. However, I think the real insight on this page is the difference in the acquisition score, where we see a 23% drop-off in these skills between the top 10 and all others, and then we see a further 20% drop down to the bottom 10. But, you know, when you look at this in overall terms, this is a 43% difference in the ability of agents to demonstrate sales skills when they're on the phone. Look, look, our research, and I know this differs from organisation to organisation, but our research indicates across most industries that around about a 20% lift in the acquisition score equates to a 10% lift in conversion rates. That's not that's a 10% lift based on your current conversion rate, 10% more than that. So this means that the businesses in the lower end of our benchmarking, in that bottom 10 bracket, have a conversion rate of at least 20% lower than it could be based on a lack of acquisition skills. And I think, as you would all know, if you did the return on investment on that, that would have some significant benefits on the bottom line of the businesses. So in summary, while there are differences in engagement or the soft skills side of things, it's the sales skills where we're seeing the biggest differences between the high-performing contact centres and the lower-performing. So let's now do a bit of a deep dive into some of the critical sales behaviours that are driving these results that we're talking about here. It's really important to note, though, at this point that while the percentages on the slide that we've been discussing previously are weighted averages, the percentages on the following slides indicate the percentage of times that we actually saw these behaviours or we heard these behaviours being actually demonstrated. So the next slide looks at some of these critical, what we'd call interpersonal skills that help create customer engagement. Now, our data shows that if a customer contacts one of our top performers, they are more likely to have a real conversation with an agent that is interested in their situation and circumstances. The tone of voice data on the bottom left of the screen here also shows that the agent in the top performers will demonstrate either a professional, an efficient or an engaging tone on 93% of times. Now, while we'd like all agents to be absolutely demonstrating an engaging tone and manner, we know that given the repetitiveness of the tasks that we have people doing in contact centres, that's not just always absolutely realistic. So we do see that if we can at least maintain a professional and efficient manner on the phones, then that is a significant effort. But if we delve into some of the specific criteria, we see some massive differences in the simple things like treating the customer with enough respect to ask and use their name. So you see there towards the right-hand side of the screen, top performers actually ask for and use the customer's name on 87% of the time, while bottom performers rarely do this and don't really care. They only do it on 21% of calls. So you'd think that something as basic as asking a customer what their name is and then using it to engage them would be a very simple skill, but you can see that in the poorer performing contact centre, that's a skill that we only see demonstrated on about 1/5 of calls. Our data also shows, however, that there are still major opportunities to improve for the top 10, particularly with the way that they engage customers. Our Seek to Engage criteria, which tests the ability of an agent to pick up on a customer triggers and respond in a conversational manner, shows that on average the top 10 only do this on 30% of the time, which is however, it is a long way ahead of the bottom 10 that only do this on 10%. However, we also can know that the individual top performer in this particular criteria actually does this on 70% of the calls. So our top performing company that we assessed seeks to engage their customers on 70% of calls. This shows us that even if you're in the top 10, there's still some major opportunities to improve. The empathize and enthuse criteria, which tests an agent's ability to pick up on the emotional cues and respond appropriately, tells the same story. The top 10 companies demonstrate this skill in 34% of the time, compared to the bottom 10 who rarely do this, if at all. However, for most of the top 10 companies, they're still a long way behind the individual top performer for this criteria, who builds greater engagement with customers by demonstrating this skill 89% of the time. So once again, another great opportunity for even the top 10 to improve. So let's now move on to the slide that we call the customer journey. While this is by no means all of the behavioural criteria that make up the benchmark, it does display most of the critical sales behaviours and those behaviours that you can put in a logical call flow that sets up a great sales conversation. The data we have is the performance of all of the companies we benchmarked that are not in the top 10, not just the bottom 10. So what you're looking at here is the average performance of all of the companies that fell outside of the top 10. The customer journey starts by assessing how well an agent engages the customer at the start of the call, and then moves through setting the scene with bridging statements into the questioning phase and then into the solution and close phase. As you can see, virtually every behaviour is demonstrated less than 50% of the time. So given that virtually every sales organisation that I've been into over the past 10 or 15 years has some sort of sales program that is based on needs-based selling, you have to ask yourself about the value of those programs if we're seeing the behaviours that are generally in those sales programs being demonstrated on average less than 50% of the time throughout many of the contact centres in Australia. But what I'd like to do now is actually get you thinking and ask you a question about where you think the biggest difference is between the top 10 and the other companies, which is the data that you've got on the screen here. To make this a little simpler, I'm not going to ask you to choose from all of the behavioural criteria along the bottom of the customer journey there, but instead pick from the 5 sales behaviours that are listed at the bottom of this particular slide. So what I need you to do now is to take a moment and choose which one of these behaviours. So we've got there, confirm assistance at the start of the call. Absolutely, I'm going to help you. Obtain and use, ask for and use the customer's name. We've also got specific solution advised, attempt to confirm the sale, and questions to discover broad needs. What I'd like you to do is have a quick chat, if you're in a room with some other people, about which of these behaviours do you think is where the biggest difference is between the top 10 and the other companies. And once you've done that, I'll give you a moment just to consider that question, and then what I'll do is we'll launch a poll and we'll ask you to select the particular response and then click the submit button. So I'll just give you a moment to think about which of those choices you'd like to make right now. Okay, what we'll do now is we'll launch the poll, and now you should see a poll up there in front of you on your screens, and what we'll get you to do is to choose and accept, submit the answers. Okay, so as the votes are coming through, we saw that attempt to confirm the sale was way out in front for a start, but now it has been reeled back in by use the customer name. So just to feed back the data to you, what we've got is around about 50% of you thinking that the questions to discover broad needs is going to be the biggest gap. Then we've got 36% of people saying use the customer's name. And then we've got about 7% saying specific solution and attempt to confirm the sale. All right. Okay. Well, now that you've all voted, and we've got most people either voting for broad questions or use the customer's name, what I'll do now is we'll click through and we will show you the data. Okay, so what you can see here is, as you can see from this graph, the top 10, while still having many opportunities to improve based on their performance, demonstrates significantly better sales skills from start to finish. However, the biggest gaps are in the regions of needs discovery and offering solution, with the biggest gap of all being the ability to act like an expert and provide the customer with a specific solution based on their needs. For those of you who chose broad needs, then you'll see here from this graph that you were very, very close, and there's very little difference between the gap in these two particular criteria. So, you know, this ability to offer a specific solution is absolutely based on the fact that you've asked some broad needs of the customer anyway. So it's not surprising that these two go hand in hand, and the gap in both of them is pretty high. But, you know, given that this is such a critical sales skill, this is a critical skill that, due to the lack of sales skills and the complexity of product offer, is only being demonstrated by about 50% of agents in contact centres, which is leaving customers to make their own assumptions about what is best for them, and in many cases more confused than when they started. Typically, agents that don't demonstrate these broad questionings and specific solution skills end up saying something like, well, we have this, this and this, which one would you like? Now, we know that given the increasing amount of choices that we have with regard to where we buy products and the increasing complexity of products, we know that customers are looking for us to help them actually make a buying decision rather than to lay out a whole lot of options. So it's not the sort of experience that drives sales outcomes and customer advocacy, I think you would agree. So as we're going through, please, if there's any questions, please remember to fire those through by using the boxes on the right-hand side of your screen. Okay, so let's have a look at the next slide here, which I think is really interesting, particularly when I explain the context of how we come up with this data. This slide focuses on the ability to ask for the sale. But before I go through that, I do want to explain that all of our customer surrogates are asked to be warm sales leads, so they're not difficult customers. And after they've been offered a solution, regardless of whether it's multiple solutions or a specific solution, we ask them to say something along the lines of, oh, okay, well, yeah, that all sounds okay. So it's in the context of a scenario behaving like, of a customer behaving like that we need to view the data that we have on the screen. So the graph here shows the difference in the rate which companies ask for the sales and how they actually go about it. So the first call out is the massive difference in the rate that the top 10 companies ask for the sale compared with the bottom 10. So 92% of the time, if you make a call into the top performing contact centres, you will get asked for a commitment to the sale, compared with only 38% in the lowest performing centres. and 51% in the companies that fall in the middle. The second key insight though here, well, that's a huge insight in itself, and you know, if lower performing companies could simply get their agents to be asking for the sale more often, they would have an increase in conversion rate. The second key insight is the difference in the way that the top 10 companies ask for the sale, where they take a much more proactive and confident approach that we know drives sales conversion. So as I said, there's some huge opportunities for companies here to get what is, I know it takes confidence to ask for the sale, but in essence, it is a very, very simple skill that we should be able to get more people actually demonstrating on sales calls. Okay, this is the final slide in this section, and it takes a slightly different view of the data and shows 3 companies that are in the top 10 that are all selling health insurance. However, what you can see here is there's quite a dramatic difference in the approach they take to, in particular, to the questioning phase. As you'll see, our benchmark shows that there is a large difference in the number and type of questions being asked, and with this, a large difference in the effectiveness of the questioning being demonstrated by these companies and the customer engagement that it encouraged. I'm not going to go into this particular slide in a lot of detail, but as you can see right at the start of the little customer journey that you've got down the bottom of the slide there is, whilst all the companies are pretty much performing at the same level with their ability to ask broad needs, open questions about the needs of the customer, there is very little capability to ask that next question, which really drills into what the customer said. And we find it's those questions that generally get to the real heart of why the actual customer has called in. So those broad needs questions to expand on the why are a real opportunity for the top performing companies as well. But the key point though, really from this slide is that as a contact centre, you need to be clear about what your questioning strategy is and how effective that is at driving the results that you're looking for. And as we're seeing here, there is a lot of variation in how companies are going about the questioning phase of the sales process. So what I'd like to do now, really to finish off, is to have a look at what the benchmark shows us that is the biggest opportunity for all contact centres. This is whether you're in the top 10, in the middle, or in the bottom 10 of the companies that we benchmarked. So we've called this piece the heart of a needs-based conversation, and it picks up on 4 critical elements that need to be put together to truly demonstrate needs-based selling. And these, as I said before, these are all elements that I've seen in every sales and development program in virtually every organisation that I've been in the past 15 years. So the key elements here, by no means all of them, but they are the heart of the needs-based selling, is the ability to ask broad questions and understand exactly what why the customer really wants the product, not just on a logical level, but on an emotional level. The specific solution, we've already discussed that. You know, I'm ringing in because I need some help to choose the right solution to me. So laying out a whole range of solutions is not necessarily that helpful and in many cases confusing. The third one is match benefits to needs. This is the ability to absolutely let the customer know what the specific product or features that you're recommending or advising the customer would suit them, how they suit the individual customer need, and very much linked to the information that we find out from the broad needs questioning. And then the final step here is one that is often missed, which is that agreement question, that after you've explained to the customer how your product's going to improve or change or add value to their life and their emotional, solve their emotional needs, is to then ask an agreement question so that we're getting buy-in from the customer before we move into the pricing and the closing and the phases of the actual conversation. So the data here shows the rates at which the top 10 perform these particular criteria against all of the others and also the bottom 10. So it's not unexpected that you'll see there that there's a dramatic difference between how the top 10 perform and the other companies do. But I think it's a really good question to actually ask, even for the top performers, how often are all four of these particular very important criteria actually demonstrated on the one call in the one sales conversation? So what I'm going to do now is just show you on the next slide here is that when we did an analysis on the top performer, so this was one of the companies that was in the top 10, what we found is that even that top performer only was able to demonstrate all four of these critical skills on 20% of the actual calls. So when a customer rings in, even if they ring this top performer, there's only on 20% of those calls should they expect to get all four of these critical needs-based selling criteria put together in the one conversation. So when you look at that, once again, it starts to make us all ask the question about the effectiveness of the development and the training, coaching and leadership that we've been providing to our people. And I think that also needs to be in the context, obviously, of churn, having young people continually coming into our organisation. It's a massive challenge for us to be able to get the level of the conversation to where we want it to be. Okay, so we've got a question come through here, is that does the broad needs questioning seem scripted, or are these dependent on the agent skill? Yeah, good question. What we find is that quite often the first broad needs question can be a relatively scripted question. So can you tell me a little bit about why you're calling in today? Can you talk me through why you actually want to change your provider? They're the sorts of questions that, or what's prompted your call today. We see them often as being reasonably scripted and often demonstrated by agents consistently from one call to the next. However, what determines whether this comes across as a scripted experience or not for the customer is what happens next. So every time the customer answers those questions, they will answer differently. And that's where the conversation needs to start to become tailored to the individual. So when I was talking to you about the slide before about your questioning strategy, we have a criteria that looks at whether you ask another question after the first broad needs questioning. And if that next question then picks up on what the customer asks with a simple paraphrase and then asks another question to drill further, so something like, look, okay, so it sounds like your experience with your previous provider was, can you talk me through when you say you were really frustrated, what that really looked like? Now, that's the sort of question that really makes a customer feel like it's a really tailored and unique conversation that they're having with you. So, in summary, the first question around broads need is often a reasonably scripted generic one, but it all depends on what happens next as to whether it becomes a great customer experience. There was a question there about whether it's only the best agents that ask the broad needs questions. I'd sort of loop back to my question, my answer before. We do find that there are some poor agents that will ask a broad needs-based question, but you can tell straight away from their response whether they're only asking the question from a compliance point of view and whether they're asking the question because they truly want to understand what's driving the customer need and why they've actually made this call into the contact centre right now. So once again, it's what happens after you ask that first question that really makes the difference. There's another question here about life experience. So given the gaps in life experience of younger staff, could this be an argument to hire a more diverse mix of people? Or is it a matrix, a matter of better training? Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I read the question. Look, that concept of life experience is something that we come across all the time. And I think, you know, if you were going to go out there and try and hire a whole lot of people with the right experience, then that would start to cause you problems with regard to just your ability to actually get the number of people that you need to hire, and probably within the wage range that is considered effective or efficient for a contact centre. I do think with the ageing population, though, there is a real opportunity for us to get a greater mix of people with various experience into contact centres. We know that often older people can stay longer and they have better life experience, so they could really add some value if we could get them in, particularly where we're talking about very complex products that actually require some life experience to truly understand. So the answer to that is yes. I think there's a massive opportunity for us to start tapping a different pool of people and bringing them into our contact centres. However, you know, if you can't do that, I don't think that the problem is insurmountable. In the end, it comes down to your training and your development. That's critical. That sort of sets up the more formal structures with how we want to have the conversations. But in the end, it's all about what the leader does on a day-to-day basis that sets the culture in the team. You know, we need to develop cultures where it is just not appropriate or it is not acceptable not to be really interested in our customers. And I know it's really hard to do that time and time again, but there are people that can do it, and there are companies that are able to encourage and support people to do it more consistently over a longer period of time. So I think it really comes back to the culture that is led by the leaders in the team and the conversations that they have many, many times a day with their agents. And look, we could go into a whole conversation about the type of leadership that you need to create a truly customer-focused culture. But one thing I will say, they are leaders who are involved. They are leaders who are having conversations many, many, many times a day with their agents. They spend lots of time in their team and they run lots of calibration sessions, both between them and their leaders, but also with their teams, to establish what best practice looks like, to establish the level of the bar. And then they have lots of conversations with their people where they are constantly listening to where that person's at and how they compare with where the bar has been set. So just, I hope that answers your question. I'm more than happy to have a broader, longer conversation with anyone about our experience in this area if required. Okay, so I don't see any more questions just at the moment. So what we'll do is let's start to think about some of the things that we could do. So it's one thing to have all of the information that we've presented here, but as we've just been talking about, it's another thing to take action and improve. Based on our experience, if you're thinking that you have a gap and would like to improve, we suggest you start by asking yourself a series of questions to identify the size of the gap and what you can do to improve. So this is by no means an exhaustive list of questions, but it is some questions that you can ask yourself about the various parts of the sales conversation, and for you to start having some internal conversations and doing some calibration amongst yourselves about how you think you're going. The questions here will be sent out also on email to you. So for those of you, and the other suggestion I'd have is for those of you that are listening to this webinar as a group, it's a great opportunity right now to actually put this up on your screen and start trying to identify where your major gaps are and what you might be able to do about it. Finally, on the next slide here, what I'd like to just talk you through is some other things that we'd suggest that you do. So using that sheets is one thing. What we'd also like you to think about is assessing your conversations against best practice. So we haven't gone through every element of the criteria that are in our best practice benchmark, but we have gone through in this slide deck some of the critical ones. So we're really encouraging you to go back through this slide deck and ask yourself some questions about how you perform against some of the particular criteria that we've highlighted in this webinar, and start to get yourself, you need to find a way of measuring where you are actually at against these criteria. The old saying, what gets measured gets done. if you don't have an understanding of the percentage of times on your calls these particular behaviours are demonstrated and a goal set for you in the future that you want to achieve, then you're very unlikely to actually be able to get the improvements you're looking for. We'd absolutely encourage you to start running calibration sessions for your frontline teams around the specific criteria that we've been talking about today. We do see a lot of calibration sessions run inside organisations, but they're largely run off QA documents that we don't think really get to the heart of the behaviours that are required for a needs-based selling conversation. Once you've got yourself an understanding of where you currently sit against critical criteria and you've set yourself up with a way of measuring those, not an easy task, but something that's essential, then we suggest that you should be setting yourself goals on the improvement that you want to see within a specific time and holding yourself accountable for changing those behaviours. And then the last one there is purely an offer for us. If you'd like to know, there's two things. If you'd like to know more about where you sit in the actual benchmark, then we're happy to have that conversation with you. We didn't want to share that sort of data to everyone through the webinar, but we are happy to talk to you about that in more detail. And we're also happy to take a small snapshot of recorded calls from you and just do a very initial benchmark for you to give you some indication of how you might be performing against some of these particular criteria. Okay, so that's 45 minutes. What I'd like to do now is really thank you, first of all, for taking your time to come along and to listen to what we have to say. As I said earlier, I know you're all busy and got a million other things that you could be doing, so we do appreciate that you've taken the time to come along and listen today. Finally, what I'd like to say is we will follow up with an email with some information that's contained in the webinar today, and there's some details there on the screen if you would like to talk to us in any more detail. But also, if you'd like any elements of this webinar maybe changed slightly or put into a different format for you to actually deliver internally in your organisation. So one of the other things we'd encourage you to do is actually take a copy of this this particular webinar and then go and have a conversation with more people inside your organisation as a starting point. So once again, thank you. We'll sign off now and hopefully we'll see you in the future.